Hey guys, tonight we're delicately unbuttoning the stiff embroidered waistcoat of the 18th century, not to admire its silken sheen. Oh no. We're here to investigate a far more personal and frankly, far more irritating aspect of historical high fashion, the relentless, undeniable, and often utterly miserable itch. Imagine yourself swathed in layers of coarse wool, constricted by whalebone, and topped with a powdered wig that's become a cozy haven for, well, let's just say, uninvited guests. We're about to discover why looking good in the age of enlightenment often meant feeling absolutely, unavoidably, and sometimes agonizingly itchy, constricted, and generally uncomfortable. Frankly, with the fabrics, the corsets, and the questionable hygiene standards, you probably wouldn't survive a week in 18th century finery without developing a serious rash and a profound longing for a pair of modern sweatpants. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments below. It's always fascinating to see where everyone's drifting off. From, now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You can almost feel it, can't you? That faint, persistent tickle under your collar, the slightly abrasive rub of a chemise that hasn't seen soap and water quite as often as you'd like. The undeniable presence of something alive, migrating through your powdered periwig. This isn't just a flight of fancy. It's a gentle, sleepy introduction to the very real, very itchy reality that lay beneath the silks, satins, and powdered perfection of 18th century fashion. We often see the portraits, the serene ladies with their towering hairstyles and tiny waists, the distinguished gentlemen in their embroidered coats and lace cravats, and we marvel at their elegance, their poise, their air of refined sophistication. But what those portraits don't convey, what the historical novels often gloss over, is the sheer, unadulterated discomfort that was frequently the price of such style. This was an era where beauty knows no pain wasn't just a saying. It was practically a daily mantra, a necessary stoicism in the face of sartorial suffering. From the moment you awoke to the moment you, finally, blessedly, undressed for bed, your clothing was often a source of constant, low-level, and sometimes not so low-level, physical irritation. The itch. Oh, the itch. It's a sensation that can drive one to distraction, and in the 18th century, it was an almost unavoidable companion. The fabrics, the layers, the personal hygiene standards, or lack thereof by our modern measure, all conspired to create a perfect storm of scratchiness. We're talking wool worn directly against the skin, or perhaps buffered by a layer of coarse linen that wasn't exactly a cloud of softness itself. We're talking about garments that were rarely washed, accumulating sweat, grime, and a veritable ecosystem of tiny, unwelcome cohabitants. The very idea of breathable, hypoallergenic fabrics was a distant dream. No, in the 18th century, if you wanted to look fashionable, you often had to learn to live with a persistent, nagging, and sometimes utterly maddening itch. But it wasn't just the itch. There was the constriction of corsets and stays, squeezing a lady's torso into the fashionable and biologically improbable conical shape. Making deep breaths a luxury and fainting spells a not uncommon occurrence. There was the weight and heat of elaborate wigs for both men and women, powdered to a fashionable whiteness, often with flour or starch, creating a perfect, warm, and slightly sticky breeding ground for lice and other tiny creatures. There were the stiff, high collars and restrictive breeches for men, making easy movement a challenge. And then there were the shoes. Oh, the shoes, often beautiful, with delicate heels and pointed toes, but offering all the ergonomic support of a wet cabbage leaf. This journey we're embarking on isn't just about listing uncomfortable garments. It's about trying to imagine the lived, sensory experience of wearing these clothes day in and day out. It's about understanding how fashion, that seemingly frivolous pursuit, could have such a profound and often profoundly uncomfortable impact on daily life, on health, and even on how people moved, breathed, and interacted with the world around them. The fact that people willingly, even eagerly, endured such discomfort for the sake of style is a testament to the power of social norms, the desire for status, and perhaps a certain historical stoicism that we might find hard to comprehend. The general acceptance of significant physical discomfort for the sake of adhering to fashionable silhouettes is a well-documented mainstream historical aspect of many periods, but the 18th century, with its elaborate constructions, offers particularly vivid examples. One quirky, lesser-known aspect of this stylish suffering might involve the specific remedies or coping mechanisms people developed. Perhaps ladies carried tiny, ornate back scratchers to discreetly relieve an itch beneath their stays, or gentlemen learned to subtly adjust a too-tight cravat without appearing flustered. The precise ways individuals dealt with these constant discomforts are often unrecorded, but human ingenuity in the face of irritation is a powerful force. The extent to which people simply got used to a certain level of itchiness or constriction, or whether it remained a constant, low-level torment, is a fascinating question for social historians who delve into the sensory world of the past. So, prepare to gently pull back those layers of silk and brocade, to peek beneath the powdered wigs and behind the tightly laced corsets. We're about to explore a world where elegance often came with a hefty price tag of physical misery, where looking good was a serious and often seriously itchy business. Let the scratchy start to our stylishly suffering soiree begin. The faint, imaginary itch from that first introduction to 18th century fashion now invites us to set the broader stage for these sartorial sufferings. Before we delve deeper into the specific garments that cause so much discomfort, let's first take a sleepy panoramic overview of the era itself, the grand, opulent, and often surprisingly unhygienic 18th century. This was a period of immense contrasts, of enlightenment and extravagance, of refined manners and rather ripe BO, of magnificent palaces and less than magnificent sanitation. It was this vibrant, contradictory, and often uncomfortably unsanitary world that birthed, and indeed demanded, these fashionable frustrations. Imagine yourself drifting through the bustling streets of London or Paris, or perhaps attending a glittering ball in Vienna or Versailles, sometime between the early 1700s and the cusp of the French Revolution in 1789. This is often called the Age of Enlightenment, a time of remarkable intellectual ferment, scientific discovery, and philosophical debate. Thinkers like Voltaire, Rousseau, and Kant were challenging old orthodoxies and championing reason, liberty, and progress. Salons buzzed with witty conversation, and new ideas about government, society, and human nature were taking root. It was an age of optimism, of a belief in the power of human intellect to understand and improve the world. Yet, alongside this intellectual enlightenment, it was also an era of incredible opulence and social stratification, particularly for the aristocracy and the burgeoning wealthy merchant classes. This was the age of Rococo and early neoclassicism in art and architecture, characterized by elaborate ornamentation, delicate pastels, and a certain playful, if highly stylized, elegance. Grand balls, masked masquerades, elaborate court ceremonies, and lavish dinner parties were the order of the day for the elite. Displaying one's wealth, status, and exquisite taste through fashion, furnishings, and social graces was paramount. The courts of monarchs like Louis XV and Louis XV in France, or George III in England, set the tone, and the rest of polite society eagerly followed suit. This conspicuous consumption and the importance of fashion as a marker of social status among the 18th century elite is a well-established mainstream historical fact. However, beneath this glittering veneer of sophistication and refinement often lay a rather less appealing reality when it came to public health and personal hygiene. While the wealthy might inhabit magnificent, airy mansions or apartments, the cities themselves were often crowded, dirty, and poorly sanitized. Streets could be unpaved, filled with mud, refuse, and animal waste. Water supplies were often contaminated, and sewage disposal was rudimentary at best. Outbreaks of diseases like smallpox, typhus, and influenza were common and often deadly. Personal hygiene standards, even among the upper classes, were quite different from our own. While the idea of cleanliness was certainly valued, full body, bathing with soap and water was not a frequent practice for many. Perfumes, powders, and scented waters were used extensively, not necessarily to enhance cleanliness, but often to mask the unfortunate bodily odors that resulted from infrequent washing and the wearing of heavy, multi-layered clothing made from fabrics that trapped sweat and grime. A physician of the time might even advise against too much bathing, believing it could open the pores and allow miasmas, or disease-causing vapors, to enter the body. Medical understanding, though advancing in some areas like anatomy and surgery, albeit without anesthesia or antiseptics as we know them, was still largely based on ancient humoral theories. Illness was often attributed to an imbalance of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and treatments often involved bleeding, purging, or complex herbal concoctions whose efficacy was questionable. One quirky, lesser-known aspect of this 18th century world might be the sheer noise and smell of urban life. Imagine the clatter of iron-rimmed carriage wheels on cobblestones, the cries of street vendors hawking everything from oysters to old clothes, the hammering from blacksmiths' forges, the braying of donkeys, the barking of dogs, all mixed with the pervasive smells of coal smoke, uncollected garbage, tanneries, slaughterhouses, and crowded human habitations. It was a vibrant, multi-sensory environment, but not always a pleasant one. The precise olfactory landscape of an 18th century city is a fascinating, if difficult to reconstruct, area of sensory history. It is within this context, this world of dazzling intellectual light and sometimes dim hygienic understanding, of aristocratic extravagance and urban squalor, of refined manners and rather robust smells, that the fashions of the day took shape. The elaborate powdered wigs, the tightly laced corsets, the voluminous skirts supported by panniers, the layers of heavy silks and woolens. These were not just whimsical choices. They were reflections of the era's aesthetics, its social hierarchies, its anxieties, and even its attempts to cope with the less savory aspects of daily life. The grandeur of the fashion was, in part, a way to create a beautiful, ordered, and perfumed personal space in a world that was often anything but. So, as you prepare to examine the specific garments that cause so much itchiness and discomfort, remember this grand, grimy, and utterly fascinating 18th century stage. It was a world teetering on the brink of profound change, an age of powdered elegance and underlying pestilence, where looking effortlessly chic often required enduring a considerable amount of very effortful and very real physical suffering. The fashionable frustrations were, in many ways, a perfect mirror of the era's own beautiful and beautifully flawed complexities. The glittering, if somewhat odoriferous stage of the 18th century is now set, and you can almost feel the anticipation, or perhaps a slight, preemptive itch, as we begin to unravel the actual garments that contributed so much to the era's fashionable frustrations. We start at the very foundation, the layers closest to the skin, and work our way outwards. And here, in the realm of undergarments and the primary fabrics of the day, you'd discover a world of coarse materials, surprising volumes, and a scratchiness that could make even the most stoic aristocrat long for a moment of unlaced, unlayered relief. Prepare to explore the fabrics of infliction, the wool, the linen, and the seemingly endless strata of underpinnings that formed the often irritating base of every elegant 18th century ensemble. For most people in the 18th century, from the wealthiest lord to the humblest peasant, the garment worn directly against the skin was the chemise for women, or the shirt for men. This was typically made of linen. Now linen, when new and finely woven, can be a relatively comfortable fabric. However, the quality of linen varied enormously. The very wealthy might afford soft, fine cambric or Holland linen, but for many, the everyday linen shirt or chemise would be made of a coarser, more robust weave, and even good quality linen after repeated harsh launderings often involving lye soap and vigorous scrubbing or beating, could become somewhat stiff and abrasive. This linen undergarment was crucial, as it was intended to absorb sweat and bodily oils, protecting the more expensive outer garments from being soiled too quickly, since those outer layers were rarely, if ever, washed. This protective function of linen undergarments is a mainstream historical fact of pre-modern clothing. But here's the rub, quite literally. Because outer garments like woolen coats or silk gowns were so difficult and expensive to clean, often requiring specialized brushing, airing, or spot cleaning rather than full immersion, the linen chemise or shirt bore the brunt of daily wear. And while it was washed more frequently than the outer layers, frequently, by 18th century standards, might still mean only once a week, or even less often for those with fewer changes of linen. Imagine wearing the same layer of increasingly grimy, sweat-stiffened linen next to your skin for days on end. The potential for chafing, skin irritation, and a general feeling of unfreshness is considerable. Wool was another ubiquitous fabric, especially for outerwear, for working clothes, and for warmth in colder climates or drafty houses. While wool can be wonderfully warm, many 18th century woolen fabrics, particularly those available to the less affluent, would have been quite coarse and prone to causing itching, especially if worn close to the skin, or if an individual had sensitive skin. Even if your linen shirt provided some barrier, the constant friction of a heavy woolen waistcoat, breeches, or petticoat could still lead to irritation. And wool, like those elaborate silk gowns, was not easily washable. It would absorb odors, dirt, and, unfortunately, provide a welcoming habitat for fleas and lice. Then there were the layers. Oh, the layers. An 18th century woman of fashion didn't just slip on a dress. She would start with her linen chemise. Over that might go stays or a corset, which we'll explore in more agonizing detail soon. Then one or more under petticoats, often made of linen, wool, or a sturdy cotton linen, blend to provide warmth and volume. Over these would go the panniers or hoops, cage-like structures made of whalebone, cane, or metal, designed to give the skirts their fashionable wide silhouette. And then finally, the gown itself, often made of heavy silk, brocade, or patterned wool, possibly with yet another decorative petticoat visible at the front. That's a lot of fabric, a lot of weight, and a lot of potential for trapped heat, sweat, and, yes, itchiness. Men, while perhaps not enduring quite the same volume of skirts, also had their layers. A linen shirt, then a waistcoat, often elaborately embroidered, then a frock coat or a more formal coat, all worn over breeches that ended at the knee, with long stockings beneath. Neckwear, like the cravat or stock, added another layer of fabric around the throat. In colder weather, additional under-waistcoats or woolen linings would be added. All this layering, while perhaps providing some warmth, also restricted air circulation and contributed to a general feeling of being rather upholstered. One quirky, lesser-known aspect of 18th century underpinnings could be the use of sleeve ruffles, or engajantes, for women. These were separate, often lace-trimmed ruffles that could be tacked or basted into the elbows of the gown's sleeves, allowing them to be removed and laundered more easily than the entire gown. While a practical solution for keeping the visible lace fresh, it still meant the main sleeve fabric of the gown itself, potentially made of heavy, non-washable silk, was in direct contact with the arm and accumulating grime. The precise construction and interchangeability of such elements are fascinating details for costume historians. It is a subject of ongoing discussion among historians of dress and material culture, just how much actual physical discomfort people of the 18th century consciously perceived or complained about regarding their clothing. Was a certain level of itchiness or restriction simply accepted as normal, a baseline that everyone endured? Or were there subtle ways of expressing discomfort or seeking relief that are not always apparent in the historical record? Surviving letters and diaries sometimes hint at the miseries of tight stays or hot wigs, but a general stoicism, or perhaps a focus on the visual impact over physical ease, seems to have prevailed, at least in polite society. So, as you imagine, yourself swaddled in these multiple layers of linen, perhaps not of the finest quality, wool, definitely not merino soft, and heavy silks, you begin to understand that the elegant silhouette of the 18th century was often built upon a foundation of considerable scratchiness and bulk. The air rarely circulated freely, fabrics rubbed and chafed, and the sheer weight of the ensemble could be tiring. This was the baseline, the everyday reality, even before we get to the more overtly torturous garments like corsets, or the socially mandated discomforts of towering powdered wigs. The fabrics of infliction were just the beginning of your stylish suffering. The slightly scratchy, multi-layered foundation of 18th century attire, with its woolens and linens of varying degrees of coarseness, now leads us to a garment that epitomizes the era's dedication to achieving an artificial silhouette, often at considerable physical cost. The corset, or stays, as it was more commonly known in the period. As you gently explore the bone-crushing, organ-squeezing reality of these formidable undergarments, you'll discover that for many women, and even some men, though less commonly, achieving that enviably tiny, fashionably conical or hourglass waist often meant that breathing deeply was an optional and sometimes entirely unachievable luxury. Imagine yourself, a lady of the 18th century, beginning your daily toilette. After the chemise, the next crucial layer, the very armature upon which your fashionable figure would be built, was the stays. These were not the soft, elasticated shapewear of modern times. Oh no, stays were serious pieces of engineering, constructed from stiffened fabric, often linen canvas or coutil, heavily reinforced with whalebone, baleen, reed, or sometimes even thin strips of metal or wood inserted into channels sewn into the garment. They were designed to mold the torso into the desired shape, typically a smooth conical form from bust to waist, pushing the breasts up and out and cinching the waist to an often alarmingly small circumference. This shaping function of stays, creating an artificial, idealized torso, is a mainstream historical fact of 18th century fashion. The process of getting into your stays would often require assistance, perhaps from a lady's maid. You'd slip into the garment, and then the lacing, usually at the back, would begin. The laces would be pulled tighter and tighter and tighter still, gradually compressing your ribs, diaphragm, and internal organs. The aim was to achieve that perfect, unyielding, V-shaped torso that was considered the height of elegance, upon which the beautiful silk gowns would be draped. Comfort was entirely secondary to the silhouette. What did it feel like to be encased in such a rigid, constricting garment all day long? Breathing would certainly be affected. The tight lacing around the ribcage would restrict the movement of the diaphragm, forcing shallower, more rapid breaths from the upper chest. Activities requiring deep breaths, like vigorous exercise, hearty laughter, or even just climbing a flight of stairs, could become a challenge. Fainting spells, or swooning, were not uncommon among tightly laced women, sometimes attributed to delicate feminine sensibilities, but more likely a direct result of restricted lung capacity and impaired circulation. The pressure on the internal organs was also considerable. While the long-term health effects of 18th century corsetry are still a subject of some debate among medical historians and costume scholars, with some arguing the dangers are exaggerated, while others point to evidence of skeletal deformation or organ displacement in extreme cases, it's undeniable that such prolonged compression would have been uncomfortable at best. Digestion might be affected, and freedom of movement would certainly be curtailed. Bending at the waist would be difficult, if not impossible. You'd learn to bend from the hips or to pick things up with a graceful, if somewhat stiff, stoop. Stays were not just for adult women of fashion. Young girls, sometimes from a very early age, were also put into softer, less restrictive stays, or jumps, ostensibly to encourage good posture and a proper figure as they grew. The idea was to train the body into the fashionable shape from childhood. One can only imagine the discomfort for a young, active child forced to wear such a confining garment. It wasn't just women who sometimes endured such constriction. While less common, Some fashionable men in the 18th century, particularly those aspiring to a very slim, elegant figure, might wear corsets or girdles under their waistcoats to achieve a narrower waist or a flatter stomach. The dandy, or macaroni, of the later 18th century, with his exaggeratedly tight and fashionable attire, might well have employed such underpinnings. One quirky, lesser-known aspect of stays involved their decoration and personalization. While primarily functional undergarments, stays could sometimes be quite beautifully made, covered in embroidered silk or fine linen, even if they were rarely seen. For those who could afford it, even the instruments of their fashionable suffering could possess a certain aesthetic appeal. Sometimes, stays might even have small pockets sewn into them for carrying tiny personal items. The psychological impact of wearing stays is also worth considering. On one hand, it might have provided a sense of being properly dressed, of conforming to societal expectations of feminine grace and elegance. It could create a feeling of being held, supported, and presented to the world in a very specific, controlled way. On the other hand, the constant restriction, the inability to breathe freely or move easily, could also be a source of frustration, discomfort, and a feeling of being physically constrained by the demands of fashion. So, as you imagine yourself, being laced into those unyielding stays, feeling your ribs compress and your breath shorten, you get a visceral sense of the sacrifices made for the sake of the 18th century silhouette. The beautiful, swan-like posture, the tiny waist, the smooth, conical torso that looked so elegant in portraits. These were achieved through a daily act of physical discipline and endurance. Breathing, it seems, was indeed sometimes optional, or at least significantly compromised in the cruel, fashionable embrace of the 18th century corset. It makes you appreciate the simple, unconstricted joy of a deep, easy breath, doesn't it? The sensation of that tightly laced corset, with its promise of an elegant, if somewhat breathless silhouette, now begins to ease in your mind, only to be replaced by a different kind of fashionable burden, one that sat, quite literally, upon your head. We now delve into the towering, powdered, and often preposterously elaborate world of 18th century wigs and hairstyles, for both men and women of fashion. These were not just accessories. They were essential statements of status, elegance, and adherence to the latest trends. But beneath the powdered perfection, these magnificent coiffures were often heavy, hot, uncomfortable, and, rather alarmingly, cozy havens for a variety of unwelcome and very tiny wig guests. Imagine yourself as a fashionable lady or gentleman in, say, the mid-1700s. Your natural hair for men was often kept short or shaved to accommodate the wig. For women, their own hair was frequently used as a foundation, supplemented with false hairpieces, pads, and wireframes to achieve the desired height and volume, which could be truly astonishing, especially in the later decades of the century. These elaborate structures were then meticulously dressed, curled, and, crucially, powdered. This use of hair powder, typically made from fine wheat starch, rice flour, or sometimes even plaster of Paris, often scented with lavender, orange, blossom, or other perfumes, to achieve a fashionable white or greyish hue is a defining mainstream historical fact of 18th century hairstyling. For men, the periwig, or peruke, evolved throughout the century from the long, flowing, heavily curled styles of the early 1700s. Think of portraits of Louis XIV. Though he was a bit earlier, his style set a trend, to the smaller, neater, and often tied-back wigs like the queue, pigtail, bag wig, where the queue was enclosed in a silk bag, or the cadogan, looped up and tied, popular later on. These wigs were typically made of human hair, the most expensive, horsehair or goat hair, constructed on a mesh or fabric base. Wearing one all day, especially in warm weather or a crowded ballroom, would have been hot, heavy, and itchy. The scalp beneath would sweat, and the constant pressure could lead to headaches. For women, hairstyles became increasingly elaborate and towering as the century progressed, particularly from the 1760s onwards. Think of those iconic images of Marie Antoinette and her contemporaries, with their hair piled high in complex constructions, adorned with ribbons, feathers, pearls, flowers, and even miniature ships or pastoral scenes in the most extreme examples. These were not styles that could be easily achieved or maintained by oneself. A skilled hairdresser, coiffeur, was essential, and the process of creating such a coiffure could take hours. The hair, a mixture of natural and false, would be built up over pads and frames, pomaded with animal fat or other sticky substances to help it hold its shape, and then meticulously powdered. And herein lay another significant source of discomfort and social interaction of the miniature kind. These elaborate, pomaded and powdered hairstyles were not typically washed or redone daily, or even weekly. They were often designed to last for days, even weeks at a time, with touch-ups to the powder and arrangement as needed. This created a warm, greasy, and slightly starchy environment that was an absolute paradise for head lice, Pediculus humanus capitis, and other tiny creatures. Itching of the scalp would have been a constant companion for many wearers of these fashionable hairdos. To alleviate the itch without disturbing the elaborate coiffure, ladies and gentlemen often used elegant, long-handled scratchers, sometimes made of ivory or silver, designed to be delicately inserted beneath the wig or into the hairstyle to provide some relief. The existence of these ornate wig scratchers is a wonderfully quirky, lesser-known testament to this itchy reality. Imagine trying to sleep with one of these towering creations. While the most extreme styles were likely for very formal occasions, even everyday fashionable hair for women could be quite elaborate. Some ladies reportedly slept sitting up, or used special pillows or headdress designed to protect their coiffures. The sheer discomfort, the weight, the heat, and the constant awareness of potential tiny inhabitants must have made a good night's sleep a rather elusive dream for the truly dedicated fashionista. The powder itself, while creating the desired aesthetic, also had its downsides. It could get everywhere, on clothes, furniture, and into the air, potentially causing respiratory irritation for some. And if you sweated, the powder could mix with the pomade and sweat to create a rather unpleasant paste. It is a subject of ongoing discussion among costume historians and social historians just how universally these most extreme hairstyles were adopted and by whom. While portraits and fashion plates often depict the most elaborate examples, it's likely that everyday fashionable hair, while still complex by our standards, might have been somewhat more practical for many, especially those outside the highest echelons of courtly society. However, the general trend towards height, volume, and powder was undeniable for a significant portion of the century. So, as you picture yourself enduring the weight of that hot, heavy, powdered wig, or trying to gracefully maneuver your towering, feather-adorned coiffure through a low doorway, while simultaneously attempting to discreetly scratch an insistent itch somewhere deep within its starchy depths, you gain a new appreciation for the phrase, suffering for fashion. The elegant, powdered perfection you see in 18th century portraits was often achieved at the cost of considerable physical discomfort, and a rather too close for comfort relationship with some very unwelcome and very tiny wig guests. It makes a simple ponytail or a short haircut seem like the height of luxurious, itch-free comfort. The image of those towering, powdered wigs with their hidden populations of tiny, unwelcome guests and the constant nagging itch now leads us to consider another closely related aspect of 18th century personal presentation, the pervasive scent of status. In an era where full-body bathing was infrequent, even among the elite, and where layers of often unwashed fabric trapped bodily odors, potent perfumes, scented powders, and fragrant pomades became essential tools. These weren't just about smelling pleasant for its own sake. They were a crucial part of social signaling, an attempt to mask the unfortunate realities of 18th century hygiene, and a way to project an aura of refinement and wealth. You'd discover that navigating the olfactory landscape of the 18th century required a strong stomach and an even stronger dose of perfume. Imagine yourself in a crowded 18th century ballroom, or perhaps at a close-quarters card game in a stuffy salon. The air is thick not just with the heat of many bodies and flickering candles, but with a complex, often overwhelming mélange of artificial scents. Ladies and gentlemen alike would be liberally doused in perfumes, their wigs dusted with fragrant powders, their clothing sometimes even stored with sachets of dried flowers or scented herbs. This widespread use of strong perfumes to mask body odor, rather than to complement cleanliness as we tend to think of it today, is a key mainstream historical fact about 18th century and earlier hygiene practices. Why was perfume so necessary? As you know, bathing habits were very different. While hands and faces might be washed daily, a full bath with soap and hot water was a much rarer event, perhaps weekly, monthly, or even less frequently for some. The linen shirt or chemise worn next to the skin was intended to absorb sweat and oils, but it couldn't work miracles, especially when worn for several days between launderings. Outer garments, made of expensive silks, brocades, or wools, were almost never washed in water. They were brushed, aired, or spot cleaned, meaning they would accumulate odors over time. Add to this the heat and sweat generated by wearing multiple layers of clothing, constricting corsets, and heavy wigs, and you have a recipe for a rather potent personal aroma. Perfumes of the 18th century were often strong, complex, and based on animal-derived ingredients like musk, from the musk deer, civet, from the civet cat, and ambergris, a waxy substance from sperm whales, as well as plant-based essential oils like rose, jasmine, lavender, bergamot, and neroli. These animalic base notes, while perhaps sounding unappealing to us, were highly prized for their fixative properties, making the scent last longer, and their rich, heady aromas. The resulting perfumes were often powerful and diffusive, designed to make a statement, and crucially, to overpower any less desirable underlying scents. Scented powders were used not just for wigs, but also for the body and clothing, finely milled. Starch or talc would be perfumed and dusted onto the skin or patted onto garments. Pomades, made from animal fats or waxes mixed with fragrant oils, were used to style hair, both natural and wig hair, and would also contribute to the overall scented aura. Even accessories like gloves or fans might be perfumed. The choice of perfume could also be a statement of wealth and status. Rare and exotic ingredients were expensive, and being able to afford and wear the latest fashionable scent from Paris or Grasse was a sign of one's sophistication and means. Different scents might also be considered appropriate for different times of day, different occasions, or even different personality types, though the nuances of 18th century perfume etiquette are often subtle and gleaned from contemporary letters, novels, and advice manuals. One quirky, lesser-known aspect of this scented world might involve the use of vinaigrettes, or pomanders. These were small, often beautifully crafted containers made of silver, gold, or porcelain with a pierced lid. Inside, they would hold a piece of sponge or cotton soaked in aromatic vinegar, strong perfume, or a mixture of fragrant herbs and spices. Ladies and gentlemen might carry these and discreetly sniff them in crowded or smelly environments, both as a personal air freshener and perhaps as a perceived protection against bad air or miasmas, which were still believed to cause disease. The precise ingredients and designs of these personal scent dispensers varied, but they offer a fascinating glimpse into the sensory challenges of the era. It is a subject of ongoing scholarly research just how effective these perfumes were at truly masking body odor versus simply layering another strong scent on top, creating a complex and perhaps not always harmonious olfactory blend. Some contemporary satirists certainly poked fun at the heavily perfumed fops and belles of the era, suggesting that all the scent in Arabia couldn't quite conceal the underlying reality. So, as you imagine yourself navigating a crowded 18th century social gathering, your senses are assailed not just by the visual spectacle of powdered wigs and elaborate gowns, but by a veritable fog of competing perfumes. It's a world where your personal scent was a carefully constructed artifice, a fragrant shield against the less pleasant realities of daily life. The scent of status was often a powerful, heady, and perhaps slightly overwhelming substitute for the simpler, fresher scent of soap and water that we take for granted. It makes you appreciate the subtle, clean aroma of modern laundry detergent, doesn't it? The heady, often overwhelming cloud of 18th century perfumes and powders begins to dissipate, and your attention, having focused primarily on the fashionable sufferings of the ladies, now turns to their male counterparts. While women endured the tyranny of corsets, panniers, and towering coiffures, you discover that gentlemen of the era were by no means exempt from their own sartorial struggles. From neck-chokingly tight stocks and cravats to restrictively tailored coats and breeches that hampered easy movement, looking like a distinguished 18th century man of fashion often involved a considerable degree of daily discomfort and a quiet battle against the constraints of one's own elegant attire. Imagine yourself as a gentleman of the 1700s, preparing for a day of business, a social call, or perhaps an evening at the theatre or a coffee house. Your outfit, while perhaps not involving the same sheer volume of fabric as a lady's, is nonetheless a carefully constructed ensemble designed to project an image of status, refinement, and adherence to the prevailing mode. Let's start at the neck. The cravat, a length of linen or lace artfully tied around the throat, was a key element of masculine attire for much of the century. In the earlier decades, these could be quite voluminous and elaborate. Later, the stock became popular. A stiffened, pre-formed band of fabric, often black, that wrapped tightly around the neck, sometimes buckled or tied at the back. Both cravats and stocks, especially if worn very tightly for a fashionable upright posture, could be decidedly uncomfortable. They restricted neck movement, could feel chokingly tight, especially in warm weather, and the starched linen could chafe the skin. The aim was to create a clean, elegant line and a dignified, almost military bearing, but the price was often a perpetually constricted throat. This fashion for tight, high neckwear for men is a well-documented mainstream historical trend of the period. Then there was the coat. Whether it was the earlier, more full-skirted style or the later, more cutaway frock coat or dress coat, these garments were often tailored to fit quite snugly across the chest and shoulders. While this created a sharp, defined silhouette, it could also restrict arm movement. Raising your arms too high or engaging in any vigorous activity might strain the seams or simply feel uncomfortably binding. The fabrics, often fine wools, silks or velvets, while luxurious, were not known for their stretch or breathability, adding to the potential for a rather warm and constrained experience, especially when worn indoors in crowded, poorly ventilated rooms. Beneath the coat, the waistcoat or vest was another essential layer. Often made of rich embroidered silk or brocade, it too was typically tailored for a close fit. While perhaps less restrictive than the coat, it added another layer of fabric and warmth, contributing to the overall feeling of being rather formally encased. And then there were the breeches. These close-fitting garments, extending from the waist to just below the knee, were usually made of wool, silk, or sturdy buckskin for riding or more casual wear. They were fastened with buttons or buckles at the knee. If too tightly cut, as fashion sometimes dictated, they could be quite restrictive, making activities like deep bending or prolonged sitting somewhat uncomfortable. Imagine trying to elegantly lounge in a salon chair while your breeches are threatening to cut off circulation to your lower legs. It's not a recipe for relaxation. Long stockings, usually of silk or fine wool, were worn underneath, pulled up over the knee and gartered, adding yet another layer to the lower limbs. Wigs, as you know, were de rigueur for fashionable men for much of the century. The heat, weight, and itchiness of these powdered creations were a shared burden with the ladies. And while men's wigs generally became smaller and less elaborate as the century progressed, they still represented a significant daily commitment to uncomfortable fashion. Consider the sheer effort of maintaining this polished if restrictive appearance. Clothes needed to be brushed, wigs powdered, cravats meticulously tied. A gentleman of means would, of course, have a valet to assist with these tasks, but the time and attention required was still considerable. One quirky, lesser-known aspect, of men's sartorial struggles might involve the pocket situation. While coats and waistcoats did have pockets, they were often not as capacious or as conveniently placed as modern ones, carrying essential items, a snuff box, a watch, a purse, perhaps a small notebook, without creating unsightly bulges in one's sleek silhouette, would have required some ingenuity. This might explain the popularity of items like fobs attached to watches or decorative snuff boxes designed to be carried elegantly in the hand. The precise design and functionality of pockets in 18th century men's clothing and how they influenced daily habits is a small but interesting detail for costume historians. It is a subject of ongoing scholarly discussion how much these fashionable discomforts for men were consciously perceived as such, versus being simply accepted as the price of looking like a gentleman. Just as with women's fashion, a certain stoicism or a prioritizing of appearance over ease was likely prevalent. However, one can imagine private sighs of relief at the end of the day when the tight stock was unbuckled, the restrictive coat removed, and the powdered wig finally set aside on its stand. So, while the image of the 18th century lady, tightly laced into her stays and balancing a towering coiffure, often comes to mind when we think of uncomfortable fashion, it's important to remember that her male counterpart was also enduring his own set of sartorial trials. From the chokehold of his cravat to the binding cut of his breeches, the 18th century gentleman often paid a daily price in discomfort for his elegant, if somewhat stiff and unyielding, appearance. It makes you appreciate the simple freedom of a t-shirt and jeans, doesn't it? The image of that 18th century gentleman subtly adjusting his restrictive stock or feeling the pinch of his tightly tailored breeches now leads us to consider the very foundation upon which all this fashionable discomfort stood, the footwear. While the shoes of the era, for both men and women, were often objects of exquisite beauty, crafted from fine silks, brocades, or supple leathers, and adorned with elegant buckles or delicate embroidery, they frequently offered precious little in the way of practical support, cushioning, or all-day comfort for weary feet. We'll now tiptoe, perhaps rather gingerly, through the world of 18th century footwear, where pretty shoes often meant very painful steps. Imagine yourself as a lady of fashion in, say, the 1760s or 1770s. Your shoes are likely to be made of silk or brocade, perhaps matching your gown, with a pointed toe and a gracefully curved medium to high heel, often referred to as a Louis heel or French heel. These heels were typically made of wood, covered with fabric or leather, and could be quite slender and set rather far forward under the instep. While undoubtedly elegant, lending a certain delicate, tilted posture, they were not designed for long walks on uneven cobblestone streets or for hours of standing at a court reception. The pressure on the ball of the foot would have been considerable, and the lack of substantial arch support would have quickly led to aching feet and strained ankles. This emphasis on delicate, often impractical heeled shoes for fashionable 18th century women is a well-documented mainstream historical fact of costume history. The construction of these shoes was also quite different from modern footwear. They were often straights, meaning there was no differentiation between the left and right shoe. They were made on symmetrical lasts and were interchangeable. You would essentially break them in to conform to your individual feet over time, a process that could involve a fair amount of initial discomfort, blisters, and rubbing. The idea of anatomically shaped, foot-specific shoes was not yet a standard practice. For men, shoes also featured heels for much of the century, though they tended to be lower and more robust than women's, often made of stacked leather. Buckles, frequently made of silver, paste, glass gemstones, or even precious jewels for the very wealthy, were a prominent decorative and functional feature, fastening a strap across the instep. While perhaps slightly more practical than the ladies' delicate silk slippers, men's shoes, especially the more formal styles, could still be quite stiff, with relatively thin soles, offering little cushioning against the hard realities of 18th century pavements or dance floors. Riding boots, of course, were a more utilitarian and sturdy form of footwear for equestrian activities or travel, but for everyday town wear or formal occasions, the buckled shoe with a heel reigned supreme. Consider the materials. Silk and brocade, while beautiful, are not known for their durability or their ability to withstand wet or muddy conditions. A lady venturing out in her finest silk shoes on a rainy London day would likely find them quickly soiled and potentially ruined. Overshoes, such as pattens, wooden or metal platforms that strapped onto the shoe to elevate it above the muck, or clogs, were sometimes worn outdoors to protect delicate footwear. But these were cumbersome and not particularly elegant in themselves. And what about comfort indoors? Even within the grand salons and drawing rooms, after hours of standing, dancing, or simply navigating the social scene in these less than ergonomic shoes, feet would undoubtedly ache. There were no cushioned insoles, no memory foam, no advanced arch support systems. Relief might only come at the end of the day when the offending, if beautiful, footwear was finally kicked off. One quirky, lesser-known aspect of 18th century footwear might involve the mules or heelless slippers worn by both men and women for informal indoor wear or in the boudoir. These offered a more relaxed and comfortable alternative to the structured outdoor shoes, though they still often featured pointed toes and decorative elements. The very existence of such distinct indoor comfort footwear perhaps hints at the acknowledged discomfort of the more formal public shoes. The specific styles and levels of adornment for these mules varied, but they represent a small concession to ease in an era of often restrictive fashion. It is a subject of ongoing research and interpretation among costume historians and podiatry-minded scholars just how much long-term foot damage, such as bunions, corns, hammer toes, or postural problems, might have resulted from a lifetime of wearing these fashionable but often ill-fitting and unsupportive shoes. While direct medical evidence from the period is often limited, it's reasonable to assume that a society teetering on high, narrow heels and squeezing their feet into pointed, symmetrical shoes was not without its share of podiatric miseries. So, as you picture yourself gracefully, or perhaps not so gracefully after a few hours, navigating an 18th century ballroom in your silk-covered, high-heeled shoes with their elegant buckles, remember that beneath the glittering exterior often lay a reality of pinched toes, aching arches, and blistered heels. The pretty shoes of the era frequently came with a price tag of painful steps, another small but significant contribution to the daily discomforts endured in the pursuit of 18th century style. It makes you want to wiggle your toes in a pair of comfy sneakers, doesn't it? The faint ache in your imaginary 18th century feet, squeezed into those beautiful but unyielding shoes, now begins to merge with a more general sense of weary resignation as you contemplate the sheer, daunting effort involved in simply getting dressed each morning. In an era of elaborate, multi-layered outfits, constricting underpinnings, and complex hairstyles, the process of assembling your fashionable ensemble was not a quick, 5-minute affair. Oh no. It was often a lengthy, laborious ritual, frequently requiring the assistance of servants and representing a significant investment of time and energy before your day could even properly begin. The agony of getting ready was a daily trial, endured in the name of 18th century elegance. Imagine yourself as a lady of high fashion, awakening in your canopied bed. Your day doesn't start with a quick shower and throwing on some casual clothes. Instead, it begins with the arrival of your lady's maid, a crucial figure in the 18th century dressing process. First, the linen chemise, your foundational layer. Then, the stays, or corset. This, as you know, was a serious undertaking. You'd hold onto a bedpost or a sturdy piece of furniture while your maid painstakingly tightened the laces at the back, cinching your waist and molding your torso into that fashionable conical shape. This process alone could be time-consuming, and depending on how tightly you were laced, quite uncomfortable. The reliance on personal servants, particularly ladies' maids, for dressing is a well-documented mainstream historical fact of aristocratic life. Once the stays were in place, the layering continued. One or more underpetticoats for warmth and volume. Then, the panniers or hoops, those wide, cage-like structures that gave your skirts their impressive, if somewhat impractical, breadth. These could be made of whalebone, cane, or even metal, and maneuvering them through doorways or in crowded rooms required a certain learned skill. Over the panniers went the gown itself, often in two pieces, a bodice and a separate skirt. or a robe open at the front to reveal a decorative petticoat. This gown, likely made of heavy silk, brocade or damask, would need to be carefully arranged and fastened with hooks, pins or ties. And we haven't even gotten to the hair and makeup yet. If you were a lady of fashion, your hair, or wig, or a combination of both, would need to be elaborately dressed, curled, powdered, and adorned with ribbons, feathers, or jewels. This process, as you recall, could take hours, and was often performed by a professional hairdresser. Then came the makeup. A pale complexion was highly prized, so white lead-based paints or powders might be applied, with all their attendant health risks, which you'll explore later, followed by rouge for the cheeks and lips, and perhaps a few strategically placed black silk patches, mouches, to accentuate a feature or cover a blemish. For a gentleman, while perhaps not quite as labour-intensive as a lady's full toilette, getting dressed was still no simple matter. His linen shirt, then the meticulously tied cravat or stock, his waistcoat, then his closely fitted coat and breeches, his silk stockings gartered at the knee, and, for much of the century, his wig, which needed to be properly set and powdered. A valet would be indispensable for ensuring every detail was perfect, from the shine on his shoe buckles to the precise angle of his wig. Consider the sheer time commitment. For a lady preparing for a major social event, the entire process of bathing, if she did, dressing, hairstyling, and makeup could easily consume several hours. Even a gentleman's daily dressing routine would be significantly longer than what most modern men are accustomed to. This was time that had to be factored into the daily schedule, time that could have been spent on other pursuits, but which was deemed essential for maintaining one's social standing and fashionable appearance. One quirky, lesser-known aspect of this agony of getting ready might involve the specific tools and contraptions used to aid the process. For example, long-handled button hooks were necessary for fastening the numerous tiny buttons on gloves or spats. Special powders and puffs were used for wigs. Ornate dressing table sets, with their myriad boxes, jars and implements, attest to the complexity of the 18th century toilette. The very furniture of the dressing room, the mirrors, the tables, the chairs designed for lengthy primping, speaks to the importance and time-consuming nature of this daily ritual. The exact inventory and design of these dressing accessories provide fascinating insights for historians of material culture. It is a subject of ongoing scholarly discussion just how much the perceived burden of dressing varied across different social classes and for individuals with different levels of access to servants. While the wealthy elite had an army of maids and valets to assist them, those of more modest means who still aspired to fashionability would have faced an even greater personal struggle to achieve the desired look. And for the working classes, while their clothing was simpler and more practical, it still involved layers and materials that were often uncomfortable and difficult to maintain. So, as you imagine yourself standing patiently, perhaps for hours, while your maid fusses with your laces, your hairdresser piles on another powdered curl, and your valet straightens your cravat for the 10th time, you can appreciate that the effortless elegance projected in 18th century portraits was anything but effortless. It was the result of a daily, time-consuming, and often physically demanding performance, a testament to the era's dedication to an ideal of beauty and status that frequently prioritized appearance over any notion of personal comfort or convenience. It makes the modern act of slipping on a t-shirt and jeans seem like an almost laughably simple and wonderfully liberating experience. The image of those adults, patiently, or perhaps impatiently, enduring the lengthy and often uncomfortable daily ritual of 18th century dressing, now leads us to consider a particularly poignant and often overlooked group of fashion victims: the children. You might imagine that childhood, at least, would be a time of comfortable, practical clothing, allowing for freedom of movement and play. But alas, in many 18th century households, especially those of the affluent, children were often treated as miniature adults, dressed in restrictive, uncomfortable, and sometimes downright hazardous versions of their parents' elaborate fashions, enduring itchiness, constriction, and the general misery of impractical attire from a very tender age. We now peek into the nurseries and schoolrooms of the 18th century, where little lords and ladies often suffered in pint-sized sartorial silence. From a very early age, sometimes even as infants, children were put into clothing that mirrored adult styles, albeit slightly simplified. Baby boys might wear long gowns for the first few years, similar to girls, but as soon as they were breeched, usually between the ages of 3 and 7, a significant rite of passage, they would be dressed in miniature versions of their father's attire. Tiny coats, waistcoats, and breeches, complete with stockings and buckled shoes. Little girls would be similarly encased in scaled-down versions of their mother's gowns, often including stays or corsets from a young age to begin training their figures into the fashionable shape. This practice of dressing children as miniature adults, with little concession to their specific needs for comfort or play, is a well-documented mainstream historical fact of the period. Imagine a small boy, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, trying to run and play while wearing stiff, closely fitted breeches, a restrictive waistcoat, and a coat that hampered his arm movements, or a little girl of similar age, her torso already confined in soft stays, her skirts perhaps made voluminous with small hoops or multiple petticoats, trying to navigate the world with the same grace and freedom as a modern child in comfortable play clothes. It would have been a constant struggle. The fabrics used for children's clothing were often the same as those for adults: linen, wool, and for wealthier families, silks and fine cottons. While some softer linens might have been used for infants' innermost layers, older children often endured the same potential for scratchiness and irritation as their parents. And just like adult garments, children's outer clothes were not frequently washed, meaning they too would accumulate dirt, sweat, and the inevitable spills and stains of childhood, becoming increasingly uncomfortable and unhygienic over time. The wearing of stays or corsets by young girls is a particularly striking example of this miniature misery. While these children's stays were generally not as aggressively boned or as tightly laced as adult corsets, they were still designed to restrict movement, encourage an upright posture, and begin the process of shaping the waist. The idea was to mold the growing body into the desired adult silhouette. For a young girl whose bones were still developing and whose natural inclination was to run, jump, and tumble, being encased in such a garment, however soft, must have been a source of constant discomfort and frustration. Medical reformers and Enlightenment thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, later in the century, began to criticize this practice, advocating for looser, more natural clothing for children. But for much of the 1700s, the miniature adult look prevailed. Even hairstyles for children could echo adult fashions. Young boys might have their hair powdered or even wear small wigs for formal occasions. Girls' hair would be styled, perhaps with curls and ribbons, in imitation of their mothers, though usually not to the same towering extremes. One quirky, lesser-known aspect of 18th century children's attire might involve leading strings or pudding caps. Leading strings were long fabric bands attached to the shoulders of a toddler's dress, used by an adult to guide and support them as they learn to walk, but also perhaps to keep them from straying too far or getting into mischief. Pudding caps were padded caps worn by very young children to protect their heads from bumps and falls as they unsteadily navigated their world. While these items had a practical, protective purpose, they also represent a certain level of physical management and control over young children's bodies. The precise age at which children transitioned out of these items and into more adult-like clothing varied, but it was all part of a structured progression. It is a subject of ongoing scholarly discussion how much these restrictive and uncomfortable fashions impacted children's physical development, their ability to play and explore, and even their psychological well-being. While some argue that children are adaptable and might not have perceived the discomfort in the same way we would, others suggest that such clothing undoubtedly limited their freedom, potentially contributed to health issues, and instilled an early awareness of the often painful demands of social conformity. So, as you picture these little lords and ladies, these miniature adults in their stiff brocades, their tiny stays, their powdered hair, trying to sit still for their lessons or play politely in the nursery, you can't help but feel a twinge of sympathy. Their childhood, at least in terms of sartorial freedom, was often a far cry from the comfortable, carefree experience we might wish for them. They were initiated into the stylish sufferings of the 18th century from a very early age, learning that looking the part, even as a child, often meant enduring a considerable degree of itchiness, restriction, and miniature misery, all in the name of being a perfectly turned out, if somewhat uncomfortable, little adult. The image of those uncomfortably dressed children, miniature adults enduring their own sartorial miseries, now leads us to consider another, often invisible, layer of 18th century fashion-related suffering. Beyond the immediate physical discomfort of scratchy fabrics, tight corsets, heavy wigs, and ill-fitting shoes, there lurked other, more insidious dangers. The unseen irritants and potentially harmful chemicals present in some fabric dyes and, most alarmingly, in the fashionable cosmetics of the era. As you explore this less obvious aspect, you discover that the pursuit of 18th century beauty could involve more than just skin irritation. It could sometimes mean flirting with genuine long-term health hazards. Let's first consider the vibrant colours that characterise so much of 18th century fashion. Those rich blues, vivid greens, brilliant yellows, and deep crimsons seen in silks, woolens, and printed cottons were achieved using a variety of natural and increasingly mineral-based dyes. While many natural dyes derived from plants, like woad for blue, weld for yellow, or madder for red, were relatively harmless, some of the mordants used to fix these dyes to the fabric, or some of the mineral pigments themselves, could contain toxic substances. For example, certain green dyes were achieved using arsenic compounds, like Scheele's green. Though its widespread use was more in the 19th century, arsenic-based pigments were known earlier. Other dyes might use compounds of lead, copper, or mercury. Constant skin contact with fabrics treated with these substances, especially if the wearer was sweating or if the fabric was damp, could potentially lead to the absorption of small amounts of these toxins over time, causing skin rashes, allergic reactions, or even more systemic health problems. This use of potentially toxic metallic salts as mordants or pigments in dyeing is a mainstream historical fact recognized by textile historians. But perhaps the most direct and dangerous exposure to harmful chemicals came from the cosmetics that were so essential for achieving the fashionable 18th century look. A pale, flawless complexion was the height of beauty for both men and women of the elite. To achieve this coveted pallor, many people used face powders and skin whiteners that were based on white lead carbonate. Lead is, of course, a highly toxic heavy metal, and its repeated application to the skin could lead to lead poisoning. Symptoms could include abdominal pain, constipation, fatigue, headaches, irritability, and in severe cases, neurological damage, paralysis, or even death. The tragic irony was that lead could also cause skin blemishes and damage, leading the user to apply even more of the toxic whitener to cover them up, creating a vicious cycle. Famous figures like Queen Elizabeth I of England, from an earlier period, but the use of lead cosmetics persisted, are sometimes anecdotally said to have suffered from the effects of lead-based makeup, though direct proof is often elusive. Rouge, used to add a touch of colour to the cheeks and lips, could also be problematic. While some rouges were made from relatively harmless plant extracts like safflower or cochineal, derived from crushed insects, others contained mercuric sulfide, vermilion, another toxic heavy metal. Eye makeup, such as kohl, often containing lead sulfide or antimony sulfide, used to darken the eyelids and lashes, also posed a risk of lead or antimony poisoning. Beyond the obvious toxins, even seemingly innocuous ingredients in cosmetics or skincare preparations could cause irritation or allergic reactions. Perfumes, as you know, were strong and complex, and some individuals would undoubtedly have been sensitive to certain essential oils or fixatives. Various creams and lotions, promising to smooth wrinkles or lighten freckles, might contain harsh astringents, abrasive powders, or other irritants. One quirky lesser-known hazard might involve the hair pomades used to style wigs and natural hair. These were often made from animal fats, like bear grease or beef tallow, mixed with perfumes. If not fresh, or if stored improperly, these fats could become rancid, leading to unpleasant odors beyond what the perfume could mask, and potentially irritating the scalp or causing skin infections. The idea of regularly applying what was essentially perfumed lard to one's head is rather unappealing from a modern hygiene perspective. It is a subject of ongoing research and debate among medical historians and toxicologists just how widespread and severe the health problems caused by these dangerous cosmetics and dyes actually were in the 18th century. Diagnosis at the time would have been difficult, with symptoms often attributed to other common ailments. However, given the known toxicity of substances like lead and mercury and their documented widespread use in cosmetics, it's almost certain that many individuals suffered ill effects, ranging from chronic low-level poisoning to more acute and debilitating conditions, all in the pursuit of fashionable beauty. So, as you imagine that elegant 18th century lady meticulously applying her white lead face paint, or that dandy proudly sporting a coat dyed with a vibrant but potentially arsenic-laced green, you realize that the stylish suffering of the era went far beyond mere itchiness or constriction. It sometimes involved a daily, intimate dance with dangerous substances, a gamble with one's long-term health for the sake of achieving a fleeting, fashionable ideal. The unseen irritants and toxic chemicals lurking in their dyes and cosmetics added a truly insidious layer to the already considerable discomforts of 18th century attire, a stark reminder that beauty in this period could sometimes be more than just skin deep. It could be downright dangerous. The rather alarming thought of those lead-based cosmetics and potentially toxic dyes causing more than just a rash now leads us from the public presentation of the 18th century self to the more private and supposedly restful realm of the bedroom. But even here, as you drift into the 18th century bedchamber, you might discover that achieving a truly comfortable and restorative night's sleep could be compromised by some of the same material discomforts and environmental challenges that plague the waking hours. From scratchy sheets and lumpy mattresses to stuffy, poorly ventilated rooms, the nighttime nightmares of the 1700s could make even the most exhausted individual toss and turn. Imagine yourself preparing for bed in a typical 18th century home, whether a grand manor or a more modest dwelling. The bed itself might be a grand four-poster, draped with heavy curtains to keep out drafts, and perhaps offer a little privacy, or a simpler wooden frame. But what about the bedding? Linen sheets were standard, and as you know from our discussion of undergarments, the quality of linen varied greatly. While the wealthy might afford fine, soft linen, many people would be sleeping on sheets that were coarser, perhaps even a little stiff and abrasive, especially if they were well worn and frequently, by 18th century standards, laundered with harsh soaps. The idea of high thread count Egyptian cotton or soft breathable bamboo fabric was a distant dream. This reliance on linen for bedding, with its varying degrees of coarseness, is a mainstream historical fact. Mattresses, too, were a far cry from the pocket-sprung or memory foam comfort we expect today. They were often stuffed with materials like straw, horsehair, wool, or feathers for the more affluent. These fillings could become lumpy, compacted, and uneven over time, requiring regular plumping, turning, and occasional restuffing. And unfortunately, they could also provide a welcoming habitat for bedbugs, fleas, and other unwelcome nocturnal companions, adding an extra layer of itchiness and irritation to your night's rest. The thought of sharing your lumpy, straw-filled mattress with a thriving colony of tiny creatures is enough to make anyone's skin crawl. Then there was the issue of nightwear. While dedicated nightgowns or nightshirts made of linen, or sometimes fine cotton, for those who could afford it, were worn, they were still subject to the same limitations of 18th century fabrics and laundering. And remember those elaborate, powdered hairstyles, especially for women. As you heard, some ladies might try to preserve their coiffures by sleeping propped up on special pillows, or even sitting up in bed, hardly conducive to a deep, restful sleep. Even men, who wore wigs during the day, would often wear a soft nightcap to bed, partly for warmth, but also perhaps to keep their shaved or short-cropped head from getting chilled, or to manage any lingering scalp itchiness from the day's wig wearing. Ventilation in 18th century bedrooms was often poor. Windows were typically small, and in an era before effective insect screens, they might be kept closed at night to keep out drafts, damp night air, which was often considered unhealthy, and of course, mosquitoes and other biting insects. This could lead to stuffy, close, and often rather smelly rooms, especially if a chamber pot was kept in the room for nocturnal necessities, as indoor plumbing was a luxury reserved for the very, very few. The air quality, combined with the potential odors from unwashed bodies, bedding, and perhaps even the lingering scent of the day's perfumes, might not have been conducive to easy breathing or peaceful slumber. One quirky, lesser-known aspect of 18th century sleep, or attempts thereat, might involve the use of bed warmers. These were long-handled metal pans, often made of brass or copper, with a hinged lid. Hot coals from the fireplace would be placed inside, and the pan would then be passed between the sheets to warm the bed before one retired. A very welcome comfort in drafty, unheated bedrooms during cold winter nights. However, one had to be careful not to overheat the pan or leave it in one spot for too long, lest it scorch the linens or, worse, start a fire. A rather alarming way to be awakened. The design and use of these bed warmers varied, but they represent a practical adaptation to the often chilly realities of 18th century domestic life. It is a subject of ongoing research for social historians and those who study the history of sleep. How these various factors, uncomfortable bedding, poor ventilation, itchy nightwear, elaborate hairstyles, and even the anxieties of the day, might have impacted the quality and duration of sleep in the 18th century. While people undoubtedly slept, the idea of a consistently deep, comfortable, and uninterrupted 8 hours might have been a less common experience than we might assume. So, as you imagine yourself settling down for the night in an 18th century bed, perhaps pulling those heavy bed curtains closed against the drafts, adjusting your nightcap, and trying to find a comfortable spot on your lumpy, straw-filled mattress, you might find yourself longing for the simple, breathable comfort of modern pajamas and a well-ventilated room. The nighttime nightmares weren't always about ghosts or bad dreams. Sometimes they were simply about the very real, very physical discomforts of trying to get a good night's sleep in a world where scratchy sheets, stuffy rooms, and unwelcome bedfellows of the six-legged variety were all too common. The slightly scratchy, stuffy atmosphere of that 18th century bedroom, with its lumpy mattresses and draft-excluding bed curtains, now gives way to the jarring, jolting reality of 18th century travel. If enduring the daily discomforts of fashionable attire within the relatively controlled environment of your home or a grand salon was a trial, imagine then compounding that misery by embarking on a long, bumpy journey, trussed up in those same layers of constricting, itching, and often unsuitably warm clothing. We now consider the added torment of travel in an era of rudimentary transportation, where bouncing carriages and cumbersome clothes combine to create a truly uncomfortable and often quite agonizing experience for the fashion-conscious wayfarer. Imagine yourself setting out on a journey of any significant distance in the 1700s. The primary mode of land travel for those who could afford it was the horse-drawn carriage. While these vehicles might look rather romantic in period dramas, with their painted panels and liveried coachmen, the reality of travelling in them was often far from comfortable. Roads, especially outside of major thoroughfares, were frequently unpaved, deeply rutted, and poorly maintained. Springs or suspension systems on carriages were rudimentary at best, meaning that every bump, every pothole, every uneven patch of ground was transmitted directly to the unfortunate passengers inside. This constant, bone-jarring motion is a well-documented, mainstream historical fact of 18th century travel. Now, picture enduring this relentless shaking and jolting while wearing the full panoply of 18th century fashionable attire. If you were a lady, you'd be encased in your stays or corset, making it difficult to brace yourself against the carriage's lurching. Your wide panniered skirts would take up an enormous amount of space in the already cramped carriage interior, likely crushing against your fellow passengers or the sides of the vehicle. Your elaborate powdered hairstyle or wig, already prone to disarray, would be severely tested by the constant bumping and swaying. Dust from the road would inevitably seep in, settling on your fine silks and brocades, and adding to the general grime and discomfort. For a gentleman, the situation wasn't much better. His tightly tailored coat and breeches would offer little flexibility as he was bounced around. His stiff stock or cravat would feel increasingly constricting with every jolt. His powdered wig would require constant readjustment. And for both men and women, the multiple layers of clothing, often made of wool or heavy silk, would become increasingly hot, stuffy, and sweat-soaked, especially during summer travel or in crowded stagecoaches. There was no air conditioning, and opening a window for ventilation often just meant inviting in more dust or rain. The journeys themselves could be incredibly long. Travel speeds were slow, limited by the endurance of the horses and the condition of the roads. A trip that might take a few hours by modern car could easily consume several days, or even weeks in the 18th century. This meant enduring those uncomfortable clothes and the jolting carriage for extended periods, with only infrequent stops at often squalid and uncomfortable coaching inns for rest and refreshment. Imagine trying to get a few hours of sleep in a lurching carriage while still wearing your stays, or attempting to eat a hasty meal at a roadside inn without completely ruining your elaborate attire. One quirky, lesser-known aspect of 18th century travel discomfort might involve carriage sickness, the 18th century equivalent of motion sickness. The constant, irregular jolting and swaying, combined with poor ventilation and perhaps the strong odours within the carriage from unwashed bodies, food, or even a poorly maintained chamber pot, could easily induce nausea, adding another layer of misery to the already uncomfortable experience. The precise remedies or coping mechanisms for carriage sickness in this period are not always well documented, but one imagines that, much like seasickness, it was a common and unwelcome companion. For many travellers, it is a subject of ongoing historical research how different social classes experienced the discomforts of travel. While the wealthy might have had more spacious, perhaps slightly better sprung private carriages, and could afford more comfortable inns, even they were not immune to the fundamental challenges of 18th century roads and vehicles. For those travelling by public stagecoach, the conditions would have been even more cramped, more public, and likely more unsanitary, with passengers of varying degrees of cleanliness and social standing all packed together. And what about the weather? If it rained, roads could turn into impassable quagmires, and carriage interiors could become damp and chilly. If it was hot and sunny, the inside of a closed carriage could become an oven. There was little protection from the elements, and your fashionable, if impractical, clothing would offer scant relief. Your fine silk shoes, as you recall, would be no match for a muddy road if you had to alight from the carriage. So, as you imagine yourself jolting along a deeply rutted 18th century road, your corset digging into your ribs, your wig askew, your fine clothes covered in a layer of dust, and a fellow passenger perhaps suffering from a bout of carriage sickness, a little too close for comfort, you realize that travel in this era was not a glamorous affair. It was an endurance test, a battle against bad roads, rudimentary vehicles, and the inescapable, cumbersome constraints of your own fashionable attire. The getting there was often a significant torment in itself, making the destination, however humble, seem like a blessed relief. It certainly makes one appreciate the smooth ride and climate control of modern transportation, doesn't it? The bone-jarring discomfort of that 18th century carriage ride, with its trussed-up passengers and cumbersome clothes, slowly begins to smooth out as your sleepy historical gaze drifts towards the latter decades of the 1700s and the very early years of the 19th century. After enduring a long era of extreme artificiality, constriction, and often downright painful fashion, you'd begin to observe the first, tentative, almost imperceptible shifts towards slightly more sensible, more natural, and marginally more comfortable styles. This was not a sudden revolution. No overnight discarding of corsets and wigs for comfortable sportswear, but rather a slow, gradual unraveling, a subtle relaxation of the sartorial stays, hinting at a future where suffering for style might become, if not entirely obsolete, then at least a little less mandatory. The late 18th century was a period of immense social, political, and intellectual upheaval. The American Revolution, 1775-1783, and, more dramatically, the French Revolution, 1789-1799, challenged old hierarchies, questioned established authorities, and ushered in new ideals of liberty, equality, and naturalism. These profound societal shifts inevitably began to be reflected in clothing. The extreme opulence and artificiality of the Ancien Régime in France, with its towering powdered wigs, vast panniered skirts, and lavishly embroidered silks, started to seem increasingly out of touch, even politically dangerous, in a revolutionary climate. This connection between the French Revolution and a simplification of fashion, particularly a rejection of aristocratic excess, is a mainstream historical interpretation. For women, one of the most significant changes was the gradual move towards a more natural silhouette, influenced by classical Greek and Roman aesthetics, which were being rediscovered and popularized through archaeological finds and neoclassical art. The exaggeratedly wide panniers began to shrink, replaced by softer, flowing lines. Waistlines started to rise, eventually reaching the high empire style popular in the early 1800s, which featured a very high waist just below the bust and a straight, often uncorseted, or only lightly corseted skirt that fell loosely to the ankles. Fabrics also began to change, with lighter weight cottons, muslins, and linens becoming increasingly fashionable, especially for day wear. These materials were more breathable, more easily laundered, and offered a greater degree of comfort and freedom of movement than the heavy silks and brocades of earlier decades. While stays and corsets didn't disappear entirely, and indeed, they would return with a vengeance in different forms in the 19th century, the most extreme, bone-crushing styles of the mid-18th century began to give way to softer, less restrictive underpinnings, or even, for some more radical fashion adopters, to no corseting at all, at least for informal wear. This was a significant, if temporary, liberation for the female torso. For men, the changes were also notable. The powdered wig, that quintessential symbol of 18th century male fashion, began its slow decline towards the end of the century. Men started to wear their natural hair shorter, often styled in a more Roman or classical fashion, sometimes still lightly powdered or pomaded, but without the heavy, hot, and itchy encumbrance of a full wig. Elaborately embroidered coats and waistcoats gave way to more sober, practical styles, often in darker colours like blue, black, or brown, influenced by English country attire and a growing middle-class sensibility. Breeches remained, but the overall silhouette became somewhat less formal, less restrictive, foreshadowing the trousers that would become standard in the 19th century. Tight, high neckwear-like stocks also began to loosen slightly, though the cravat in various forms would remain a feature of men's dress for some time. One quirky, lesser-known factor that might have influenced these shifts towards simpler styles was the growing popularity of Anglomania in some parts of Europe, particularly France, in the decades before the Revolution. English fashion, perceived as more practical, more understated, and more suited to an active, outdoor life, think of country squires in their sensible woolen coats and riding boots, began to be emulated by some fashion-conscious continental aristocrats, offering an alternative to the extreme formality of French court dress. The precise impact of Anglomania on mainstream fashion trends is debated by historians, but it certainly introduced new ideas and aesthetics. It's important to emphasize that this was a slow and uneven transition. The most extreme and uncomfortable fashions didn't vanish overnight. Older people, or those in more conservative circles, might cling to the styles of their youth, and even as some garments became more comfortable, new fashionable discomforts would inevitably arise in later periods. The human desire to use clothing to express status, identity, and adherence to the latest trends is a remarkably persistent one. However, as the 18th century drew to a close, you can sense a subtle shift in the sartorial wind, the emphasis on extreme artificiality, on literally reshaping the human body to fit an idealized and often biologically improbable silhouette, was beginning to yield, just a little, to a greater appreciation for more natural lines, lighter fabrics, and a hint, just a hint, of increased comfort and practicality. It wasn't exactly the dawn of sweatpants and sneakers, but it was a step away from the most egregious examples of stylish suffering you've encountered. The slow unraveling of those tight laces and the gentle deflation of those towering wigs signaled perhaps a quiet, collective sigh of relief from the long-suffering bodies of the fashionable elite. The image of those slowly deflating wigs and slightly less restrictive gowns at the tail end of the 18th century now brings our itchy, often uncomfortable, but hopefully quite sleepy journey to its gentle conclusion. You've endured the scratchy wools and endless layers, the cruel embrace of corsetry, the weighty, vermin-infested wigs, the pungent perfumes masking less pleasant realities, the restrictive breeches and collars, the painful shoes, the sheer agony of getting ready, and even the miniature miseries inflicted upon unfortunate 18th century children. You've also glimpsed the unseen irritants in dyes and cosmetics, the potential for nighttime nightmares in stuffy rooms, and the added torment of travel in cumbersome clothes. As we drift off, we can now let out a collective, soothing sigh of relief for the soft cottons, the breathable fabrics, and the generally more relaxed and sensible sartorial standards that grace our own sleepy time. Think back to the sheer, unadulterated physical discomfort that was so often the price of looking fashionable in the 1700s. The constant low-level itch from coarse linens and woolens, exacerbated by infrequent washing and layers that trapped heat and sweat. The way a tightly laced corset could restrict your breathing, squeeze your organs, and make a simple bend at the waist a major undertaking. The hot, heavy, powdered wig, a breeding ground for lice, requiring special scratches for relief. The cloying perfumes battling valiantly, if not always successfully, against the bodily odours of an era less acquainted with daily soap and water. Remember the gentlemen, not immune to suffering, with their neck-chokingly tight stocks, their stiffly tailored coats that made raising an arm a gamble, and their breeches that might have looked elegant but felt like a tourniquet after a few hours, and those beautiful but treacherous shoes, with their high heels and pointed toes, offering a daily penance for the sins of style, ensuring that every step on a cobblestone street was a minor adventure in pain management. The sheer time and effort, the armies of maids and valets required to simply assemble these elaborate human constructions each morning is, in itself, exhausting to contemplate, and spare a thought for those poor children, dressed as uncomfortable, miniature adults, their natural exuberance constrained by tiny stays and stiff, impractical garments, learning from their earliest years that fashion often meant misery. Even the very materials of their clothing, the vibrant dyes that gave them colour, or the lead-based cosmetics that promised a fashionable pallor, could carry hidden dangers, unseen irritants that went beyond mere itchiness to pose genuine health risks. The mainstream historical awareness of the dangers of lead in cosmetics, for instance, is a stark reminder that beauty could indeed be hazardous. Even the supposed sanctuary of the bedroom, as you saw, offered little respite, with scratchy sheets, lumpy mattresses, and stuffy, poorly ventilated rooms potentially turning a night's rest into another form of endurance test. And if you dared to travel, the bone-jarring misery of a springless carriage, combined with your already uncomfortable attire, would ensure that the journey itself was a form of stylish torment. But then, as the century waned, came those first, tentative whispers of change. The move towards more natural silhouettes, lighter fabrics, the slow decline of the powdered wig. These were harbingers of a future where comfort might, just might, be allowed a small voice in the dictates of fashion. It wasn't a revolution, not yet, but it was a subtle unraveling, a collective, perhaps unconscious, sigh of relief. The reasons for these shifts were complex, social and political upheavals, new aesthetic ideals, a growing, if still rudimentary, concern for health and hygiene. But the result was a gradual move away from the most extreme and punishing aspects of 18th century dress. The precise interplay of these factors in driving fashion change is a rich field for historians of culture and dress. One final quirky thought to drift away on: imagine the sheer, unadulterated bliss an 18th century fashion victim might experience if they were suddenly transported into your own comfortable, modern pajamas, your soft cotton t-shirt, your breathable, stretchy fabrics. The sensation of unrestricted movement, of air circulating freely, of no itching, no pinching, no squeezing. It would likely feel like a miracle, a revelation of unparalleled comfort. It puts our own occasional complaints about a slightly scratchy label or a too tight waistband into a rather amusing perspective, doesn't it? As the last images of those powdered periwigs and tightly laced stays fade into the soft darkness, we can thankfully appreciate the sartorial ease of our own era. We can choose comfort over constriction, breathability over brocade, and the simple joy of clothes that allow us to move, to breathe, and to sleep without a constant, nagging reminder of their presence. The stylish sufferings of the 18th century, for all their visual splendor, serve as a wonderful, sleepy reminder of how far we've come in our quest for clothes that are not just fashionable, but also, blessedly, kind to our skin and our skeletons. The grand, if often itchy, pageant of 18th century fashion now gently recedes, the rustle of silks and the faint scent of stale powder dissolving into the quiet of your own comfortable space. The tightly laced stays, the towering wigs, the constricting cravats, all these instruments of stylish suffering can be laid aside, relegated to the dusty costume chests of history. Their story, for tonight, is told. Allow your mind to drift away from those uncomfortable ensembles, from the parlors and ballrooms where beauty often knew considerable pain. Let go of the image of itchy wool against skin, or the struggle for a deep breath within a whalebone cage. Instead, feel the soft, yielding comfort of your own bed, the gentle touch of your sheets, the easy rhythm of your own unimpeded breath. The elaborate, demanding fashions of the past no longer have any claim on you. Here, in this peaceful haven, there is only the blissful ease of relaxation, the simple luxury of unconstricted rest. This journey through the sartorial trials of a bygone era perhaps leaves you with a newfound appreciation for the simple comforts we often take for granted: the softness of cotton, the freedom of movement, the ability to choose clothes that feel good as well as look good. The daily endurance of those 18th century fashion victims, their willingness to suffer for style, now seems a distant, almost unimaginable thing. Imagine those elaborately dressed figures at the end of a long day of social performance and physical restriction, finally unlacing, unpinning, and unwigging, feeling the blessed relief of their bodies being free. Let their long overdue comfort become a soft, lulling presence, a gentle invitation for you to embrace your own well-deserved ease. Let the memory of their fashionable frustrations dissolve into the soothing darkness behind your eyelids. Your breathing deepens, your limbs grow heavy and wonderfully still, and any lingering thoughts of historical discomfort become as faint and unimportant as a forgotten itch. The only fashion that matters now is the effortless comfort of your own nightwear, the only style, the profound grace of deep, restorative sleep. Rest now. Let go completely. Sweet dreams. End of script. Sweet dreams.